Well, today we're going to talk about salt and light. We've been doing a series called The Jesus Way, and we're talking all about how to live like Jesus. What did he teach us about sort of his ethics, his way of living life, and how can we emulate that and try to be faithful Christians? And Jesus, during his Sermon on the Mount, which we're going through all summer long, he kind of opens it up with these things called the Beatitudes, these blessings to certain kinds of people. And he says, look, the kingdom of heaven is for people like this, right? It's for the poor. It's for all these kinds of people. And then he goes into the beginning of his sermon and he kicks it off with kind of this metaphor or this group of metaphors about salt and light. Now, I just want to open by saying I love salt. I love salt too much. Okay, so many of you know me well enough to know that I'm a moviegoer. I often go to the movie theater, and how many of you, when you walk into a movie theater, the smell hits you, and it's just like, I have to get popcorn. I don't really have a choice in the matter. Is anyone else like that, or is it just me? Okay, good. We got some hands, so I'm not alone. Yeah, it's like that for me, where it takes literally some of the strongest willpower that I have ever mustered just to go to a movie theater and not get popcorn. And the thing is, though, if it was just the popcorn, and I've gone to movie theaters before where they didn't have salt, where it was just the popcorn, and then I looked for the salt, and I was like, do you have salt shakers or anything? And they're like, no, we're out. And it totally ruined the experience. Like, I actually don't care that much about the popcorn. It's more of a vehicle for two things, butter and salt. And I got to be honest, I mean, for me, even the butter is more of a sticky substance that can cause the salt to adhere so that I get more of it, right? In fact, I put so much salt on my popcorn, I'm guessing most of you, even those of you who like salt, if you saw how much I salt my movie theater popcorn, would be appalled, would be absolutely like, that's unhealthy. You're going to die. Don't do that. How can you eat that? I love salt. I'm not going to drink it or whatever by itself, but I will put so much of it on popcorn, you'll think you might as well be drinking it, right? Okay, so salt, it's not hard for me to understand, okay, the value of the taste of salt. It's also not hard for me to understand the value of light. How many of you remember the last time that you experienced a blackout, right, at your house? The internet went out and all the lights went down. Now, how many of you are night owls? Any night owls as opposed to morning people? Yeah, we have salt lovers and night owls here. So I'm a big night owl. My wife's a big night owl. We spend most of our free time in the dark. But not literally in the dark, just in the dark of night, right? But what allows us to do that is light. And every time there's a blackout and it's dark at night and we're trying to just like do something, we're not ready to go to bed yet, but it's so dark and it's hard just to live by candles and flashlights or whatever, right? I miss the light. It's a daily necessity, and it makes a big, big difference when I can just flip a switch and go, yes, light, salt. These things are just pervasive in our lives to the point where most of us fail to appreciate just how necessary they are. Now take that, okay, however much you like salt and light, and imagine a world, okay, where they're even more valuable. Harder to get, more necessary to survive, right? More scarce, right? This is a time in Jesus' day where they didn't have light bulbs. So to get light was a bit more of a process. It was a bit more rare, right? They didn't have big factories and things like that. So salt even was something you had to be careful with. You had to make sure that you had enough. And Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth. You are the light of the world. So we're going to read that passage right now from the scriptures. It comes from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20, and this is the NIV translation. It says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden, neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. This passage, what I love about the Sermon on the Mount is I genuinely feel like many of the main ideas are simple enough to be grasped by a child without the need for an interpreter, right? A lot of what Jesus says here is common sense. It's clear. We know what salt is. We know what light is, okay? We know the value of these things. But at the same time, it's also, the sermon can often be one of the easiest parts of Scripture to misunderstand. Right? One of the most difficult parts to sort of wrap your mind around well and actually live it out and figure out how am I supposed to respond to this? There's been lots of differing interpretations in the church over the millennia about what we're supposed to make of Jesus' teaching here. Okay? For example, one of the things that Jesus was trying to clarify, but which has so often gone missed or underrepresented, right, when we're thinking about the sermon, is he says, I didn't come to abolish this stuff. I didn't come to get rid of or abolish the law and the prophets, okay? Now, it's easy to ignore that or to misunderstand what he's saying there. What does he mean? I came to fulfill it, right? We're going to talk about all that this morning. But he says things later in the sermon, and you may recall, if you've read it before, like, you've heard that it was said, and then he'll say something that was said in the scriptures, in the law and the prophets. And then he'll say, but I tell you, right? And that sounds like, yeah, that's what the scripture said, but I'm abolishing that, and I'm telling you something different. Lots of people interpret it that way. But before he does any of that, he makes a very clear and explicit statement, I have not come to abolish. Not the least letter or stroke of a pen is going anywhere. That's not what I'm here for. Don't misunderstand. So we have to keep that firmly in mind, and we have to talk about the theme of this passage, which is this. Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets. Okay? This is essential to understanding Jesus, to understanding his way, to understanding his self-identity, what he understood himself to be doing, right? If you take Jesus away from the Old Testament scriptures, you're going to miss out. You're going to misunderstand, and you're not going to get the Jesus that we have in the New Testament. So, here is the first part of this sort of portion of the sermon that sticks out to me. You see, Jesus' standards in this sermon, okay, are far from easy. I think we can agree. Right? If you read the whole sermon, and you will if you come every Sunday throughout the summer here, right? You will notice that some of the things he's preaching, it's not actually easier than the Old Testament, but oftentimes it's significantly harder to do what he's saying. And in this very passage, he says, unless your righteousness is greater than the Pharisees and the experts of the law, that's a pretty high standard, okay? Because let me tell you this. The Pharisees were a group, a very popular group of religious leaders in the Jewish faith, okay? And they were known for their righteousness, okay? They had not only the law and the prophets, and they knew it. Like, seriously, Pharisees knew large portions of the Old Testament, like whole books, right, by heart. It was not uncommon for them to have memorized word for word Genesis through Deuteronomy and more. Like, seriously, okay? This is a culture where the Jewish people took so seriously the words of God in the Old Testament. They knew their scriptures, and they worked hard to fulfill the letter of the law, right? To do everything that it said. And more than that, it wasn't just the law. They also had this authoritative oral tradition about how to interpret the law, how to apply it to the most obscure and minute circumstances. And they were careful not just to obey the law, but to obey these traditions that they'd come up with about how to understand the law. So, the experts in the law and the Pharisees, these are groups of people that Jesus' listeners would have heard, and they would have said, okay, so they're the standard. That's the good people. That's the rule followers. That's the obedient ones. And he says, I tell you truly, unless your righteousness is greater than theirs, you will not even enter the kingdom of heaven? What are you saying, Jesus? What are you trying to do here? Trying to make us all feel helpless and hopeless? Trying to make us all feel guilty? What in the world is going on? And yes, if you're wondering, the law and the prophets was a common way in that day to refer to the entire Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, right? So he is talking about the Old Testament you're familiar with. And he's saying, yeah, I'm not getting rid of any of that. I'm not abolishing any of that. In fact, you should follow it. Not the smallest letter or stroke is passing away. What does he mean exactly by abolish, by the way? In the first century, okay, it's an easy word for us to understand, but I want to be extra clear. In its original context, abolish meant disobey and reject its authority. I did not come to disobey the law. I did not come to teach others to disobey the law. I did not come to teach others that they should disregard the Old Testament. That is not why I'm here. I did not come to abolish it. I came to fulfill it. But because of what these people understood about the Pharisees and the experts in the law, this statement would have left them just utterly shocked. And after I've explained it, I'm hoping a few of you are feeling the same way. What in the world are you talking about? How could anyone be more righteous than that? I certainly haven't memorized Genesis through Deuteronomy, let alone followed everything in it. I don't even know everything in it. How in the world could I possibly enter the kingdom of heaven? It leaves us with this bad news. How could we possibly gain entrance? How can anyone be saved? How can anyone be right with God? And that's intentional. But that leads me to my second point, which is this kind of tension going on. And you might miss it, right, if you don't recognize the kind of impossibility that Jesus is talking about with this salt metaphor. So my second key point this morning is simply this. For the true disciple, okay, failing to meet Jesus' standards might actually be impossible. So first we heard that Jesus' standards are so high, they're even higher than the standards of the Pharisees and the experts of the law. They're so high that when you read the sermon, you probably should feel, I'm not good enough. If any of you read the sermon and you think, yeah, I'm pretty much there. Wow. We might have a pride issue, okay? I'm not there. No. The sermon is tough. It's hard teaching. It's ethical high ground. It's as good as it gets, let me tell you, okay? But as high and impossible as that standard seems, at the same time, we're getting this tension that failing as a true disciple to meet Jesus' standards might be impossible. Here's what I mean by that, okay? Strictly speaking, you might not know this. I didn't know this. But salt can't lose its saltiness. Okay? The word there doesn't actually mean saltiness, just to be clear. It means the flavor. Okay? So that's just the translation, how they've meant to put it out. But literally, the flavor of salt cannot be lost because salt is a stable compound, chemically. So if salt loses its flavor, that's because it's no longer salt. It's something else entirely. As long as it is salt, it will be salty. Right? So what in the world do you mean once a salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? This is a very strange question. Now, lots of interpreters over the years have tried to come up with some understanding of what in the world Jesus means. And they've looked at, okay, well, in that day, there were some bakers who would use some like bricks in their ovens that were made of salt, and under the high heat over time, it would eventually change the chemical construction of the salt, so it was no longer salt and therefore no longer salty, and they'd have to throw it out. So maybe that's what Jesus is referring to. Maybe? I mean, you can look for, and then there's like a bunch of different suggestions that scholars have made over the years about what in the world Jesus is talking about. But here's what I think is the most probable one. The most likely one, okay? There's actually, in the first century, there was a rabbi, and his words, a conversation that he had, this Jewish rabbi, with a questioner who was trying to trick him, right, is recorded in a document called the Talmud. So this is a first century rabbi in Judaism, and he is asked by his questioner, when salt loses its flavor, how can it be made salty again? Sound familiar? Right? And then the rabbi responds by salting it with the afterbirth of a mule. Fun fact, mules are sterile. They cannot have children. So the afterbirth of a mule, what? How can it be made salty again? By salting it with the afterbirth of a mule. His questioner responds, then does the mule, being sterile, bear young? And then the rabbi responds, can salt lose its flavor? Okay, so hear and understand. What Jesus is probably saying here is not, how can a disciple of mine lose their saltiness? If you lose your saltiness, I'm going to throw you out. Not exactly. It's more like, if you're really my disciples, you're going to be salty. Now, I want to be clear here. I am not recommending that you be aggressively offended all the time or use strong language. And that's not what I mean by Christians should be salty. Okay? What he means, right, this metaphor that he's using, is that we should be like seasoning that makes the world taste better. Right? It's about not losing our flavor. And what do you mean not lose your flavor? Well, if you had it to begin with, you ain't going to lose it. Okay? Because it's not about trying really hard to be good or to be salty. It's about the fact that if you've become my disciple, I have transformed who and what you are. Your chemical composition has changed spiritually, right? And now you just are the salt of the earth. And if you say to me, I'm a disciple of Jesus, I just don't care about following any of his commands. Okay, well then you're about as useful as salt that's lost its saltiness, which is to say, you're not a true disciple then. Because true disciples care very much about listening to Jesus' words and following his commands. That's just what it means, if you think about it, to be a disciple, an apprentice to someone. How would you say, I'm so-and-so's disciple? Don't listen to anything the guy says. But I definitely follow him. No, it's nonsense. It's a contradiction in terms, and Jesus is pointing this out. You can't be salt that loses your saltiness. Okay? Which should give us hope, because while his standards are high, maybe like impossibly high, at the same time he's saying, don't worry, if you're my disciple, you're going to get there. These things are going to start to happen in your life. It's going to be natural. It's going to flow out of who you are in me. Okay? So let's keep thinking about this. We don't want to be counterfeit disciples. But then he also gives this other example of light and a city on a hill. Now, a couple of pieces to note there. First of all, Jerusalem, if you didn't know, was a very important city to the Jewish people. And that very important city was also built on a hill. And in the Old Testament, it was often referred to as the light of the world. So it's very possible that he's not just referring to any city on a hill, but the city that they would be familiar with, the light of the world. You are Jerusalem. You are what Jerusalem was meant to be. You, church, are fulfilling Jerusalem, the light of the world. You're supposed to be a beacon for the world so that they can see God. Your life should reflect God so well that when people ask, who is God, they can look at the church and say, kind of like that. That's what his character is like. He's a servant. He loves. He sacrifices himself for the good of others, right? He teaches. He's there. He never leaves anybody behind. He cares about the widow and the orphan and the immigrant, the poor, the downtrodden, those who are oppressed, right? Jesus is like this, and he says, I'm showing you God, now you go and be like me. Jesus also calls himself the light of the world, by the way. So if he's calling us the light of the world, he's saying, do what I'm doing. Reflect God as I'm reflecting God. Follow me. Do it like me. Okay? I've got actually a couple of pictures, too, of some lamps. I'm hoping they'll show up here. From first century Palestine. Okay? These were clay lamps, and they looked about like that. And you see that big hole in the middle? That's where they would put oil into the lamps, which was what the fuel that it would burn on. And then they would put some kind of little cotton or something to burn in that small hole on the edge, right? And they would light that, and that would give off this very, very weak light. Okay? So lamps in this time were maybe not what you're thinking of in terms of these super bright helpful things. They were very small. What in the world does he mean by a lamp being put on its stand and giving light to the whole house? I don't know about you, but even my electric lamps don't give light to everyone in the house. I need quite a few lamps and quite a few lights to light my house. What about you? So what in the world does he mean? Well, again, context. In this time, most Jewish homes were one room. Just one room. So if you took a lamp like this and it gave off this dim light and you put it up on a lampstand in the middle of the room, it literally gave light to everyone in the house. Not much. It didn't have to be this radiant, glorious, amazing light. It just had to be enough to see by. I think that's important because I think Jesus knew that he is God and we are not. That he's going to perfectly do this and be the light of the world to end all lights. But he also knew that we were going to be a little bit more like a lamp or some torches in a city on the hill in the distance in the middle of the night. You can see it and it gives you light and it leads you to safety and it gives you what you need in the moment, but it doesn't have to be everything, right? So what I'm saying is there's a little bit of grace in this metaphor. Being the light of the world doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. It means we have to trust that if we are being faithful, Jesus will make it enough. He'll cover the gap, so to speak. But there's another thing that makes me curious in this light giving everyone to the house. And he says, so let your light shine so that people will see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Here's why this confuses me, because in Matthew 6, just a little bit later in the Sermon on the Mount itself, Jesus tells us that we're not supposed to, when we're serving or when we're helping people, when we're doing good works, we're not supposed to let our right hand know what our left hand is doing, which is like this really fancy way of saying, you're not supposed to do it for show. Don't be like the hypocrites and the Pharisees. There they are again. Who do their good works to be seen by others, right? So that they will be praised and that people will think well of them. We're not supposed to do that. But if we're not supposed to do that, then what does it mean that we're supposed to let our light shine before others? Am I not supposed to hide it? Didn't you tell me not to let my right hand to do what my left hand, or not let my right hand know what my left hand is doing, right? It's a bit of a tension here. And so I've been thinking about this tension, and what do we make sense of this? What does he mean, let your light shine before others? Are we supposed to make our works a big deal and let everybody see them? Or are we supposed to do them like secretly and let almost no one know, except maybe the person we're helping, right? Now, there's a helpful quote that sort of summed up my personal thoughts on this, right? And it comes from a guy named A.B. Bruce. And he simply said, show when tempted to hide. Hide when tempted to show. Okay? So pride can take you either way, right? Pride can tell you, right now, being a faithful Christian is not going to look like the popular thing. Doing what's right here might get me a few lost friends. Doing what's right here might not make everybody think awesomely of me. There are times when doing the right thing is hard and when it's not going to make everybody love you. Right? And when that happens, when you're needing to do a good deed, but it's not what you want to do, and you definitely don't want other people to see you doing it, show when tempted to hide. Let your light shine. That's why you're here. You are the light of the world. On the other hand, okay, if you are tempted to show, I'm going to do these good works, and then people will think I'm a great Jesus follower. Or then people will think I'm a really good person, right? Maybe they'll start following me, and I'll start gaining followers on Instagram or new subscribers on YouTube or something, right? When you're tempted to show, right, not because you're literally trying to serve people, but because you think it's going to get you some awesome reputation or acclaim or money or fame or whatever, right? That's when you need to pull it back. Do it just for God to see and not for everyone else to see sometimes, right? So as a church, we have to think about how to do that corporately too. It's good for us to go out and do service Sundays. And we're not trying to hide the fact that we're serving people. We're trying to let our light shine. But it needs to not become about us being awesome. It needs to be about glorifying God. And sometimes it's okay to go out and help somebody and not post about it. Does that make sense? I hope it does. It's a tension, but it's a tension we can hold, and it's a tension that Jesus teaches both sides of. Don't let pride drive your actions. Let love drive your actions. Okay, so we're trying to make sense of this tension between Jesus' standards are super high and almost impossible, and also if you're a disciple of Jesus, it's almost impossible not to do this stuff. Well, how do we make sense of all of this? Jesus is awesome for a lot of reasons. One of my favorite things about Jesus is that he takes a lot of paradoxes, like how God loves us so much, but how he also is just and he's got to punish sin. He takes paradoxes like that, and Jesus tells us, look, it can be both. I'm going to show you how. And he did this in himself. Jesus did what was impossible for us so that we might experience what is possible with him. One more time. Jesus did what was impossible for us so that we might experience what is possible with him. And this brings us to what Jesus means in this central part of this passage where he says, I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. What does he mean by fulfill the Old Testament scriptures? What he means, I think, can be actually sort of teased out by thinking about the concept of meaning. He does three things with the meaning of the Old Testament. He shows us the meaning, okay? So he fulfills the Old Testament by walking and behaving in a way where he never sinned. Okay? If Jesus did something and the Pharisees were like, you're not supposed to do that, the law says, wrong. You misunderstood the law. Not that he's breaking the law, he's not. He's following the law in every case. But he's following it according to God's interpretation of it, not their human tradition. Do you understand the subtle difference there? Okay, the Pharisees would sometimes call Jesus out on sin, but the Bible tells us he never sinned. So he shows us what the Old Testament was really meaning, what it was pointing to. That's one way he fulfills it. Here's another way he fulfills it. He clarifies the meaning. What in the world do these obscure passages mean? How is it supposed to apply to my daily life when you're telling me how I'm supposed to treat my ox? I don't have an ox. Right? So how am I supposed to apply a passage like that in the Old Testament? Well, he clarifies the meaning of those things by summing up the law. Love your neighbor as yourself. Right? It's not ultimately about the ox. It's pointing to a greater, deeper truth. And Paul talks about that specific example in another place in the New Testament because he's following Jesus, teasing out the fuller meaning of the Old Testament. What is the intention? You might call it the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. You've probably heard that term, right? Sometimes we get so caught up in trying to do exactly what the law says, whether it's human laws or God's law, and we forget that we should be thinking about why is the law there to begin with? What's its purpose? What is it driving at? And that is where Jesus refocuses things. And the last thing is that Jesus completes the meaning of the Old Testament. The Old Testament was pointing to something, but it wasn't the finished job. Okay? The New Testament tells us that God's law in the Old Testament, it's not that there was anything wrong with it, it's just that it was meant to serve a purpose. And that purpose was not to show us the perfect way. Jesus gave a new law. Okay? Moses went up on Mount Sinai and brought down the Ten Commandments and the law. But that was the imperfect version. The greater Moses, Jesus, went up on the mountain and preached the Sermon on the Mount. The Word of God completed, fulfilled. The new law, the new Moses, greater than the old law. He elevates it. He takes it to the next level and says, no, it's not just that you shouldn't murder. It's not just that you shouldn't commit adultery. It's not just that you shouldn't do these things. It's about your heart. It's deeper than that. God wants you to be a kind of person. He wants you to be salt. He wants you to be light, not just pretend you're salty or act as though you're light. There's a big difference between pretending and being. And the only way for that to happen is transformation. And that cannot come from ourselves. Which leads me to my last and most important point. Jesus says that we're not supposed to set aside these commandments. We're supposed to be virtuous. We're supposed to be obeying everything that he commands us. There is an important aspect of obedience, but at the same time, Jesus did what was impossible for us. None of us is going to completely fulfill the law. None of us is going to completely fill up obedience to everything Jesus commanded. We ought to be striving for that, but we are sinful, fallen creatures, and we need grace. And Jesus made that possible for us. That is what the cross was all about. Because the cross was him fulfilling the Old Testament too. It was him saying, I am the sacrifice. I am enough. My blood covers your sin. My righteousness is your righteousness when you put your faith in me and just follow me. You don't have to do it perfectly. You have to do it authentically. And you have to trust that I am enough when you are not. When you fall down, you can get back up because I've made it possible for your legs to be healed. I've made it possible for your wounds to be transformed. I've made it possible for you to be a new creation, to be born again, to have new life in me. That's what Jesus did on the cross. That's what was validated and signified by the resurrection. And that is the hope and the good news that we have. That even though our faithfulness will never be as great as it needs to be to enter the kingdom, his faithfulness was greater than the Pharisees or the experts of the law or yours or mine or anyone's. It was perfect, it was complete, it was enough. And in his sacrifice, he took the penalty that was ours so that we could live forever with God and we could enter the kingdom of heaven even though we fall short. The key is that once you get the key to the kingdom and you get to enter in, you don't then say, I'm done. No need to walk in Jesus' ways. Because if you're really a disciple, if you're really salt, if you're really light, that will show through. That will be who you become. And so we should trust Jesus to make us more and more salt and light as a people. Because Jesus fulfilled God's intention in the law and the prophets. And he can fulfill everything that God intends for you. With that, I'm going to move us into a time of communion.